The truth was that Marissa carried frustrations far deeper than anyone realized. Beneath her polished surface lay resentment and fatigue she never admitted to. She lived alone with few friends and little family support, spending her days surrounded by children who reminded her of the things she lacked in her own life. While most workers found joy in watching their students grow, Marissa seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. Her smile, once convincing, began to feel strained. No one at Sunshine Corner reported her behavior. Parents adored her, children knew her name, and supervisors valued her apparent discipline. The daycare's bright walls and cheerful routines shielded her from scrutiny. In an environment built on trust, suspicion rarely took root. And so, the small cracks in Marissa's mask, when unnoticed, left to spread quietly until they threatened to break open. The day it happened began like any other, with gray skies and the sound of steady rain tapping against the daycare windows. Parents hurried in with umbrellas, rushing to drop off their children before heading to work. Inside, the usual cheerful songs played on a small speaker, but the atmosphere felt heavier than normal. Rain always meant the children would be confined indoors, and restless energy filled the playroom from the moment the day began. The teachers tried to keep order with puzzles, coloring books, and group games, but the noise level grew louder as the hours went on. Evan was especially animated that Thursday. He had woken early, full of excitement, and his boundless energy spilled into every corner of the room. He zoomed toy cars across the floor, built towers out of blocks, and laughed so loudly that other children abandoned their own activities to join him. To most of the staff, his enthusiasm was harmless, just another sign of a lively child with an active imagination. But to Marissa, the boy's constant movement and noise seemed unbearable. She watched him more closely than anyone else, her expression tightening every time he darted across the rug or shouted with joy. By the time lunch was over, the children were wound up, bouncing from one activity to another, their small voices echoing through the hallways. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the staff prepared the mats and blankets for afternoon rest. Nap time was usually a quiet pause in the day, a chance for teachers to regain a sense of calm while the children slept. The lights dimmed, lullabies played softly in the background, and one by one, the children settled into their mats. Evan, however, refused to stay still. He rolled from side to side, kicking off his blanket, whispering to himself, and occasionally giggling. A few of the children nearby stirred in response, but most remained half asleep. Marissa's eyes followed Evan's every move, her body stiff as she sat in her chair. To her, his defiance felt deliberate, a disruption to the order she craved so deeply. In those quiet minutes, when the room was expected to be silent, her irritation grew heavier, pressing down like the storm outside. What happened next would later be pieced together through forensic evidence and testimony, but no one saw it clearly in the moment. Marissa rose from her chair and approached Evan's mat. Witnesses recalled nothing unusual until the discovery later that day, but investigators would later explain how she pressed a pillow firmly over his small face. Evan squirmed beneath the blanket, his legs kicking weakly, but the music and the hush of the rain masked the faint sounds of struggle. Within minutes, the movement stopped, and the room was once again calm. Marissa adjusted the blanket neatly, tucking it up to his chin as though he had finally drifted to sleep. From across the room, it looked no different from any other child at rest. She sat back down in her chair, composed and silent, while the storm continued outside. To anyone passing through, the daycare appeared peaceful. But beneath one small blanket, the truth was already irreversible. When the soft lullaby ended and the classroom lights brightened, the children stirred slowly from their mats. Teachers began moving quietly between them, gently waking those still curled beneath blankets. Most children stretched, rubbed their eyes, and reached for their water bottles. It was part of the daily rhythm, familiar and comforting. At first, no one noticed anything wrong. From across the room, Evan appeared to be sleeping peacefully, his blanket neatly tucked, his small body still. It was only when one of the staff members leaned down to wake him that unease began to ripple through the room. She called his name softly, expecting him to blink awake, but his body remained limp. She shook him lightly, then with more urgency. His skin felt cooler than it should have, and there was no rise or fall of his chest. Panic flashed across her face, and she called for help. The other children, sensing something was wrong, grew restless, their chatter filling the room as staff tried to usher them toward another area. The call to emergency services was frantic. Within minutes, the small building that had always been filled with laughter and routine was filled instead with sirens and flashing lights. Paramedics rushed inside, their bags clattering against the floor as they hurried to the boy's side. They tried desperately to revive him, but their efforts were in vain. Evan was pronounced dead inside the daycare he had walked into only hours earlier, smiling and full of life. The news spread quickly through the town. Parents who had left their children at Sunshine Corner only that morning were horrified, some racing back to collect them the moment they heard. Many assumed it was a tragic accident, perhaps an undiagnosed medical condition or a sudden, unexplainable event. Shock turned to grief as families clutched their children tightly, struggling to comprehend how such a thing could happen in a place they trusted so completely. Evan was only 3 years old, full of laughter and boundless energy, while Marissa Lane, the woman entrusted to care for him, hid a darkness no one could have imagined. The Sunshine Corner Daycare sat on a quiet suburban street where maple trees shaded the sidewalks and bicycles leaned against front porches. From the outside, the daycare looked like something out of a picture book, a pastel blue building with bright yellow shutters, cheerful murals of smiling animals on the walls, and a playground that sparkled with new swings and a tiny slide. Every morning, parents pulled into the small parking lot, relieved to leave their children in what they believed was a safe and loving environment. Sunshine Corner had been open for years, with a spotless reputation and waiting lists that stretched months ahead. For many families, getting a spot there felt like winning the lottery. Inside, the daycare smelled faintly of crayons, soap, and freshly baked snacks. The main playroom was a burst of color shelves lined with board games, puzzles, and stuffed animals. Alphabet posters ran across the walls, and a large rug marked with shapes and numbers filled the center of the room. The staff greeted each child with smiles and warm voices, guiding them gently to cubbies where tiny shoes and backpacks were neatly stored. Parents often lingered for a few moments, reassured by the sound of children laughing and the sight of their little ones blending into a place that seemed designed for joy. Among the children who attended, 3-year-old Evan quickly became a favorite. He had big brown eyes that sparkled with curiosity, a laugh that rang through the halls, and boundless energy that sometimes made it hard for him to sit still. Evan loved toy cars and would race them along the windowsills, narrating adventures only he understood. Other children followed his lead, and even when his games grew loud or chaotic, they couldn't resist joining him. To his parents, Sunshine Corner was more than just a daycare. It was the space where Evan was learning to explore the world, make friends, and grow. The staff, at least on the surface, appeared attentive and kind. Each worker had been carefully chosen, their names proudly displayed on a bulletin board with cheerful photos. Parents trusted these adults completely, handing over their children each morning without hesitation. Sunshine Corner had built its reputation on being a safe haven, a place where working parents could go about their day knowing their children were cared for. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. If anything, the daycare was almost too perfect. The walls were always spotless, the toys always neatly arranged, and the children's artwork always displayed like little trophies. It gave the impression of order and control, the kind of environment where accidents were unlikely and misbehavior was quickly corrected. Parents felt grateful that their children were in such capable hands. But as with many stories that later turned tragic, the surface told only part of the truth. Beneath the cheerful colors and the orderly routines, the daycare carried secrets no one suspected. Sunshine Corner was not immune to hidden flaws, and within its walls, cracks had already begun to form. For now, though, no parent saw them. They kissed their children goodbye, waved through the windows, and drove away, confident that they had left their most precious treasure in the safest place they could imagine. Marissa Lane appeared, at first glance, to be the kind of daycare worker any parent would trust. She had a calm smile, neatly tied hair, and the kind of soft voice that made children stop crying when their parents left for work. Her resume boasted years of child care experience, and her references spoke of her patience and reliability. To parents dropping off their children, she seemed like the perfect caregiver, attentive, professional, and endlessly composed. In a place like Sunshine Corner, where the staff felt more like an extended family, Marissa blended in seamlessly. But those who spent more time with her began to notice little details that didn't quite match the image she projected. Other workers sometimes caught the way her jaw tightened when a child refused to follow directions, or how her eyes grew cold when playtime became too loud. She rarely raised her voice, but there was a sharpness in her silence that unsettled the people who worked alongside her. When parents came to visit, however, the mask slipped back into place. She would crouch down, tie a shoelace, or straighten a crayon box with an almost exaggerated gentleness. Stress in child care was nothing new, and most assumed Marissa's occasional moodiness was just exhaustion. After all, looking after a dozen children at once was no easy task. Many teachers brushed off her behavior, telling themselves everyone had bad days. Some felt uneasy but convinced themselves it was nothing serious. They were grateful for her ability to stay composed when children had tantrums. If a toddler threw blocks or screamed in frustration, Marissa would step in with a firm look and steady hands. At a glance, it seemed she had control where others struggled. Evan, though, seemed to bring out another side of her. His bright energy and constant movement clashed with her preference for order and quiet. While other children quickly quieted during story time, Evan wiggled and whispered. During nap time, while others fell asleep within minutes, Evan fidgeted and hummed to himself. To most teachers, his liveliness was simply part of his charm. To Marissa, it appeared to be an irritation she could not fully hide. On several occasions, staff noticed her holding him by the shoulders a little too firmly or sighing heavily when his laughter grew louder than the others. Police arrived soon after, beginning what they believed would be a routine investigation into a child's sudden death. At first, they treated the scene gently, noting the details of the classroom, speaking quietly with shaken staff members, and recording the timeline of events, but as they examined Evan's body, details began to surface that unsettled even the most experienced investigators. There were faint marks around his mouth and nose, not the kind of signs left by a peaceful nap. His skin bore tiny imprints of fibers that matched the fabric of the daycare pillows. The possibility that this was more than a natural death crept into their minds. An autopsy later confirmed their suspicions. Evan had not died of illness or accident, he had been suffocated. The revelation shook the town to its core. Sunshine Corner was immediately closed, its bright murals and tidy playground now overshadowed by police tape and news cameras. Parents who once felt safe leaving their children there were consumed with fear and anger. The story dominated local headlines, spreading beyond the small community, capturing the attention of people everywhere who wondered how such evil could exist in such an ordinary place. The investigators returned to the daycare with sharper eyes, determined to find out who was responsible. Every worker was questioned, every moment of that afternoon reconstructed. Behind the smiling photos on the staff bulletin board, they knew someone was hiding a terrible truth. The tragedy had shifted from heartbreak to suspicion, and the search for justice had only just begun. Detectives focused their attention on Marissa almost immediately. Her presence during nap time, her known frustrations with Evan, and small inconsistencies in her account of the day drew suspicion. At first, she appeared composed, calm in the sterile interrogation room as officers asked routine questions about the children, the schedule, and the events leading up to the tragedy. She insisted repeatedly that Evan had simply fallen asleep and that she had checked on him like any responsible caregiver. Her voice was steady, her eyes fixed on a point across the table, giving little away. Investigators pressed further, recounting details from the autopsy and the fibers found on Evan's skin. Each question chipped away at her story, revealing cracks that were difficult to ignore. Marissa repeated her version of events, emphasizing her frustration with keeping the room calm during nap time. As the hours stretched on, detectives noted small shifts, hesitations, slight changes in her posture, a tightening of her hands. What had seemed like unwavering composure began to falter under the weight of mounting evidence. After hours of questioning, she finally admitted to what had happened, though her explanation was chilling in its simplicity. She confessed that when Evan refused to settle down, she had lost control. What began as a brief attempt to quiet him escalated, ending in him suffocating beneath the pillow she had pressed against his face. She described the moment clinically, as if recounting a series of actions detached from emotion. For the detectives, it was a confirmation of their worst fears, the proof that this had not been an accident but a deliberate act of violence. The confession sent shockwaves through the town. Parents who had trusted her were left reeling, grappling with the betrayal and horror of what had occurred. The daycare's walls, once symbols of safety and childhood joy, now seemed sinister, a place where trust had been fatally misplaced. Families mourned Evan deeply, struggling to reconcile the image of a happy, energetic child with the reality of his death. Local authorities moved quickly to arrest Marissa, charging her with first-degree murder and ensuring she would no longer be able to harm another child. Court proceedings drew intense media attention. Prosecutors painted a detailed picture of her actions, presenting evidence from the daycare, testimony from staff, and the forensic findings that confirmed her role in Evan's death. They emphasized her awareness of what she was doing and the deliberate nature of her actions, highlighting how she had hidden her growing frustration behind a mask of professionalism. Her defense attempted to argue a moment of lost control, but the jury found her accountable for her actions. The verdict was swift, a conviction of murder that would keep her behind bars for life. Evan's parents were left to navigate a grief that no sentence could fully heal. Their loss was permanent, a scar that would never fade. Yet, through memorials, community support, and the remembrance of his joyful spirit, they found a way to honor him. Sunshine Corner Daycare became a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil can hide behind ordinary appearances and that vigilance, even in places of supposed safety, is never optional. The story of that rainy Thursday remained etched into the town's memory, a stark example of how quickly trust can be shattered and innocence can be stolen.